It's a widely accepted fact that the mining industry contains some of the more perilous jobs in the career pool. It pays ludicrously well, of course, but has a notably higher mortality chance to salary ratio when compared with other blue-collar work. It's certainly understandable, however. From poor air quality to cave-ins, and all the way to hidden gas pockets and equipment failure, there's plenty of things in this line of work that are less than accommodating to human life. At the absolute very least, however, these risks, they're expected. Those that work in the field not only anticipate these risks, but gladly accept them as such when venturing below the surface. Aside from freak accidents, things usually only go wrong in semi-well documented ways. With that in mind, allow me to paint a picture. Something went wrong, and 4 individuals from a 12-man crew have now perished. The rest are stranded with no foreseeable way to the surface, and yet none of the previously mentioned risks are to blame. In fact, the mine itself, or anything naturally forming for that matter, isn't to blame either. And so with all those potential hazards ruled out, for what reason could this have occurred? Whatever you guessed is likely far from reality, likely not even remotely close. The situation makes absolutely no sense, and the explanation will make even less sense. So for that reason, I'll attempt to break everything down as simply as possible from the beginning. And to start, I'm Finnegan. I'm an equipment operator for a coal mining operation run by Riker Energy Sources, a rather newly founded company headquartered in Wyoming. And overall, the job was a phenomenal opportunity, and little to no experience was needed due to the company being notably unestablished in the industry, and with the compensation structure only falling slightly below the national average. And for someone fresh out of high school, with no plans for college, it was an opportunity too perfect to pass up. And after 2 years with the company, I'd gotten into the rhythm of doing my job, and I did it particularly well. Factoring in the generally unchanging crew of 11 other individuals I worked with, we overall functioned like a well-oiled machine. We pride ourselves on that ability to work efficiently, yet we were rather dependent on our routine. However, at the beginning of the shift, 12 hours ago, that routine was broken, and as if the forces of the universe took notice of this, everything went sideways in very short order. And thought we were on waste removal for the week, I questioned, flipping through the thoroughly stained schedule taped to the window of the managerial office. Y'all lucked out this time, and the survey team discovered a sizable iode deeper down. Got no extra crews to work it, so y'all are up for now. Now our foreman stated, reviewing the paper himself before retrieving and unfolding an additional piece of paper from his pocket. And it looks like all of y'all are set to be on this shift. Now I'd just wait by the truck for everyone else to show up, he added, gesturing to the vehicle. I simply nodded and walked over to the truck, leaning on it as I sipped the mug of bitter coffee I'd hurriedly brewed before arriving. And rather promptly, the other 11 members of our work pool arrived, and we quickly filed into the back of the vehicle. And it was little more than an industrial tour bus, but the crew compartment was notably cramped, with 12 individuals packed up inside. And I was seated in the very back row, and a large, bearded individual by the name of Angus filled the seat beside me. New plans. Certainly beats shoveling rock for another 12 hours, eh? He commented with a slight chuckle. His accent was thickly Scottish, as were most of his mannerisms. And still gonna be shoveling rock, bud. And at the very least, we get to use the fun tools as well. Margot responded from the middle row. She was like me, an equipment operator, so we often worked interchangeably on the same task. Being the second oldest member of the crew at 50 years old, she was well respected by everyone else. Before anyone else was able to join, the personnel carrier jolted to life, as it began shakily moving down into the depths of the mines. Despite being rather large, all equipment was electrically operated to reduce the risk of fumes accumulating, and as a result, it began picking up speed impressively fast. Despite our assignment being roughly 500 feet below the surface, through various crowded and winding shafts, we were expected to arrive in around 10 minutes. Around 5 minutes into the ride, Angus tapped me on the shoulder and motioned to my coffee mug, which since had become rather cold. "Gonna finish that, Finn?" he politely questioned. "Have at it. Not the most pleasant brew," I responded, handing him the half-full mug. "Thank you, laddie," he replied, finishing the remaining beverage alarmingly fast. Shortly thereafter, the vehicle jolted to a halt as we arrived at the assignment site. It was a dead-end cavern with quickly assembled support beams and lighting systems giving it the definitive appearance of a work in progress. We exited the vehicle and quickly began divvying up the work as we always did at the start of a larger task. A gruff, older individual that we simply referred to as Davy took the lead as per usual. He was the oldest individual on the crew, at an astonishing 60 years of age, and had plenty of experience in the industry to back his leadership. After the majority of the crew had been assigned their respective tasks, he pointed in my direction and provided me with my job for the shift. "Finn, Margot, grab the drills and hit those markers. Depths should be marked below," he ordered, gesturing to the various chalk markings on the nearby cavern wall. "Mark, get with Angus and start prepping some charges. All right, let's have a good day," he added before clapping his hands. Everyone broke out and began working as instructed, with Margot and I making our way across the cavern towards a line of parked utility trucks with various types of equipment stacked in the back. We grabbed the large handheld drills we were using during the shift and lugged them over to the specified wall. "Shall I do the honors, boss?" Angus questioned, before removing the protective cover over the switch. Davy consulted his radio and after receiving the all clear, responded with a simple thumbs up. Angus flipped the switch as a thundering explosion echoed through the cavern, the shock wave shortly making its way up with a level of force that shook the vehicles parked beside us. After a few moments, we loaded back into the trucks and once more returned to the site, now which had a sizable hole blown into the cavern wall, revealing a notably large amount of coal winding throughout the inside of the stone. We began surveying the area and once more began our assigned duties. Margot and I received our drills and made our way over to the wall to continue the extraction process. However, before we could make any progress, Margot stopped and placed her drill on the ground. "Something wrong?" I questioned. She appeared fixated on a particular section of the wall, one that was visibly lighter colored than the rest of the nearby stone. "Not sure if I'm seeing things, but I think that's concrete," she responded, picking up a nearby hammer and further chipping away at the area. After a few heavy swings, a larger chunk broke off the wall, revealing visible rebar underneath. "Well, I'll be damned. Davy, check this out," she added, calling Davy over as she continued removing the area surrounding the rebar. Davy arrived and appeared just as astonished at the sight. He retrieved a piece of paper from his jacket, referencing it as he continued glancing at the opening. "Shouldn't be anything man-made here. The company has just barely started excavating at this depth," he stated, removing a few additional pieces with his hand. "There shouldn't even be anything, aside from this mine, around for 10 miles, he added. He radioed back up to the surface and after a brief conversation, returned, looking visibly more confused than he was previously. "Looks like it's a new development to management as well. If it seems sound enough, they suggest that we either drill around it or through it," he informed us, once more glancing at the opening as he referenced his documents. Why not just set a charge in that spot? Should give us an idea of how deep it goes. And we may still stay on schedule too, Mark suggested, having likewise taken notice of the discovery along with overhearing the conversation. He was relatively new on the crew, having only been there a few months. He was also about 4 years older than me, at 25, but had proven his efficacy enough to warrant a reasonable say in matters. Davy contemplated it for a moment, before shrugging and walking off. Don't see why not. Grab Angus and let me know when it's ready, he responded. And after drilling a sizable pocket to place the charge in, and hammering around additional layers of rebar, the charge was set and everyone once more drove to a safe distance. As before, Angus received the green light and detonated it, with the thunderous crack of the material splitting echoing through the cavern. We returned to the site, and with all members of the crew now being aware of this strange anomaly, everyone gathered around the opening as the dust finally began to settle. To our immense surprise, the explosion didn't reveal additional layers of concrete, nor even normal stone on the other side, but rather what appeared to be an opening into another cavern. Margot, having retrieved a lamp from one of the trucks, powered it on and shined it through the hole, only to reveal something even stranger. It was a warehouse. A sizable one at that, and with various wooden crates and shelves that extended well beyond the reach of the lamp's light. Now what did we just come across here? Angus asked, approaching the opening. He motioned for Margot to hand him the lamp, and after retrieving it, stepped inside the opening, which was barely a foot above ground level. He shined the light around, revealing a ceiling of at least 20 feet in height, and even more rows of shelves and crates extending through the room. And soon thereafter, another 4 of us grabbed a lamp and followed, entering the strange room. Everything was covered in a noticeably thick layer of dust, the type that only accumulates after years upon years of abandonment. The air was visibly polluted with it, and after walking roughly 100 feet deeper, we were forced to turn back due to the relatively unbreathable nature of the environment. However, before returning, our lamps were able to vaguely illuminate a door at the other end of the storage room. It was made of solid metal and had one of those wheel-like mechanisms for opening it, something you might find inside of a ship. Davy, being practically asthmatic after venturing inside, gestured to the nearest workers and grabbed some respirators from the truck. I'd rather figure out what this is before we blow anything else to pieces, he ordered. The workers nodded and returned carrying a crate of them, with Davy distributing them out to each of the crew members before pointing to the opening. I need 5 people to check it out with me. It's not a sightseeing tour. We're detailing every last thing we find and then heading back out to continue our work. Regardless, everyone mask up while the ventilation system does its job. I, being rather intrigued, immediately volunteered, as did Angus, Margot, Mark, and a rather newer individual by the name of Al. Once everyone had donned their gear, we once more entered the opening and began venturing to the other side. The many crates we passed along the way were mostly unmarked, with some having labels that had become far too faded to understand what was printed on them. While looking at the crates, I failed to notice that Mark had paused directly in front of me, and as a result, I nearly took both of us to the ground by accident. My fault, man. All good? I asked, regaining my footing. He briefly scanned the left side of the room through the scaffolding shelves. No worries, I could have sworn I saw something moving around, is all. He replied, seeming marginally uneasy. Angus briefly turned around and joined in as well, before continuing onward. Probably just a rat, lad. Might even be a raccoon. Perhaps even the boogeyman, he added with a chuckle. No way in hell a raccoon's all the way down here. Doubt even a rat would bother, Al included. It seems that only leaves the boogeyman then, Angus responded, releasing a hearty laugh. The conversation was abruptly cut short by a loud creaking further ahead. Davy had reached the door at the other end and was attempting to open it with little avail. Mind cutting the banter and lending me a hand? He asked, annoyance clear in his voice. Angus rushed over and, upon grabbing the wheel, managed to begin successfully turning it. It released an ear-splitting, grinding noise, clearly indicative of the amount of time that had passed since it was last opened. Eventually it came fully loose, and the door slowly creaked open. The rest of us rushed over, and upon shining our lights through the doorway, and discovered that the facility was likely far more sizable than we originally anticipated. The hallway extended to both the left and right of the door, with more doors and what appeared to be a mess hall at the furthest end. 2 other hallways extended from the main one as well, both leading further into the structure. Older fluorescent lights lined the ceiling, but considering the clear age of the structure, and chances of them working were negligible. Should we, split up? Nor are we just going to search the place one room at a time? Mark questioned. Davy considered it for a moment before responding. I'd rather leave it to the survey crew to fully map this place. Check what you can and reconvene here in 20. Yeah? He replied, and everyone nodded as we began splitting up to check the structure. I went towards the mess hall, as Angus began attempting to open the nearest door, while everyone else went in their own directions. I reached the mess hall fairly quickly, and discovered 4 rows of lunchroom-style tables, with a large box television mounted on the wall. A counter extended on the furthest wall, leading into what appeared to be a kitchen. I hopped the counter, knocking over a metal tray which hit the ground with an echoing crash. Margot, being nearby, called over, "Everything all right over there, Finn?" Having spooked myself to some degree, I composed myself before responding. "All good, and just being clumsy is all." I made my way through the rather sizable industrial kitchen, and coming across various canned goods and cookware. And another door seemingly led out of the kitchen, but upon attempting to open it, I quickly concluded that it was locked. The most striking aspect of the kitchen, however, was the seemingly used appearance of it. Not in the sense that it had been recently used, but rather at some point. Multiple pots were found within a large sink basin, with the mold growing within, suggesting they hadn't been unused when placed inside. Even some of the counters had invisible residue underneath the profoundly thick layer of dust. Eventually, I glanced at my watch and realized that around 15 minutes had passed. I once more hopped the counter, this time being mindful of the remaining trays sitting on its surface. Before I could make my way into the hallway, however, I had picked up a distinct sound from inside the kitchen, particularly the sound of something small, such as a metal utensil, clattering against the ground. I quickly shined my lamp back over the counter, and was met with a rather unnerving sight. A small pair of eyes was looking back at me, not in some overly unnatural sense, but rather something comparable to the eyes of an animal at night, just 2 dimly reflective, almost shimmering dots. I froze, and I kept my light on the eyes. They were small enough to fit the profile of a medium-sized rodent, but the more alarming aspect was how they seemed directly behind the counter, yet still cleared the top of it. The counter, being around 3.5 feet off the ground, made this especially concerning. I slowly backed away, keeping my light on the strange set of eyes as they remained unmoving and aimed in my direction. Once I was back in the hall, I quickened my pace and eventually made it back to the door we had entered in, where Margot and Davy were waiting. Davy was flipping through a dusty folder of papers he had discovered, while Margot was reviewing a binder she had. "Glad to see you made it back. Find anything?" Margot questioned. "Not really. Found the kitchen and a locked door. Nothing of much substance," I replied, pausing for a moment. And I considered trying to explain the small creature that was evidently in the kitchen with me, but eventually settled with a more rational explanation. There was also a big rat or something in there. Kinda freaked me out, to be honest. Davy briefly looked up from his papers before returning to them once more. The place must be infested then. Came across a good few of them at the offices I found. Would be lying if I said they didn't spook me as well. Margot was seemingly about to add something to that before Angus and Mark arrived. Both were empty-handed, but Mark was clearly rather shaken up. "Anything interesting?" Davy questioned, still flipping through the stack of papers. And found another storage room with even more boxes. This lad walked right into a rat nest and nearly shat his britches, he added, lightly elbowing Mark on the shoulder. Mark seemed rather annoyed, but got along well. Shined my light into the hallway and caught the eyes of about a dozen of the rodents. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. As he finished, a loud crash once more echoed through the kitchen. At the other end of the hall, we each shined our lamps in that direction, only to be met by none other than the same eyes as before, peeking around the corner. With the profound amount of dust in the air throughout the facility, it was impossible to make out a definitive form to the animal. But the eyes were clearly a foot above the ground. We remained silent for a moment, as us and the animal stared each other down. And eventually the silence was broken by my watch alarm, signifying that 20 minutes was up. The animal scurried away, making an audible noise while doing so, as we composed ourselves once more. "Spooky little bastards," Angus commented, looking down the other end of the hall. "Say, have you lads seen Al around here?" he added. We looked around, likewise taking notice of his absence. He had gone down a hallway the furthest to the end, and with each of us having a timekeeping device of some sort, it was more than expected he would be back at the end of the 20 minutes. Davy seemed rather frustrated and placed the stack of papers in his jacket as he walked over to the entrance of the hall. He called out multiple times with no response, and eventually started to return as his lamp began to dim and flicker. Once back with the group, he removed and replaced the battery to no avail. As the lamp proceeded to fully extinguish itself, he shook his head before addressing the group. "Nothing but more rats and more dust, and I'm sure as hell not about to go down there with this piece of shit," he added, hitting the defunct lamp. Now go get the lad," Angus commented, as he made his way towards the hall. He eventually disappeared around the corner as the echoing sound of his footsteps gradually faded, becoming completely inaudible. Davy gestured towards Margot's lamp, which she handed to him. "You three head back. I'll wait for them," he stated, shining the light down the hall. "The radio doesn't seem to be working all that well here. And get a unit at sight and relay your findings to the surface until we get back." We simply nodded in unison and began making our way back through the warehouse. The atmosphere had noticeably shifted, and unease was becoming evident in each of our mannerisms. While I kept my light aimed straight ahead, Mark was shining his to either side, clearly still on edge due to his encounter within the facility. Margot not having a lamp anymore, and stayed close by at the front of the group. And eventually breaking the silence, "Say, do y'all really think those are rats?" she questioned. Mark caught up with the group before joining in as well. "I'd like to think so. Why do you ask?" Margot seemed to gather her thoughts for a moment before answering his question. And I found this small office and a couple of them were in there. All I could see was their eyes peeking from behind the desk. Same with my encounter. Pretty damn creepy, Mark interjected. Margot once more seemed to collect her thoughts before continuing. Well, it's just... As I left the office to meet up at the entrance, I turned around and one of those sets of eyes was almost at the ceiling. Mark and I turned to face her and noticed that she was visibly shaken up from the recollection. She continued on. I like to imagine that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me or something, but there was nothing at the height that a rodent could have been sitting on for that to make sense. It was just a wall, and once I began approaching it with the lamp, it went right back down to the desk in an instant. Mark and I glanced at each other, but otherwise remained silent. Despite the surreal nature of that description, it evidently matched what each of us had experienced as well. We didn't directly mention it, but something about that structure just wasn't right. And it was a conclusion each of us appeared to silently arrive at as we quickened our pace and exited from the opening. The other 6 members of the crew were eagerly waiting as our arrival was met by multiple lights shining through the hole. They looked marginally on edge as well, but before either party could exchange information, the sound of thundering footsteps came from within the facility and grabbed our attention. We returned the beams of our lamps to the opening, though we were unable to immediately spot anything due to the freshly disturbed dust further limiting our visibility. The footsteps were originating from within the warehouse as a shadow became visible. It was Davy. It was Davy in a full sprint that was virtually impossible for somebody that age. Angus was soon behind, seeming to be clutching at his arms. The light Davy was holding had clearly stopped working. Upon exiting the opening, Davy immediately signaled in the direction of the trucks and barked orders between raspy breaths. "Load up the trucks. We're leaving now." Angus was soon behind, and it became evident fairly quickly that he'd been significantly injured, with a stream of blood seeping between his fingers that were clutching his arm and pulling at his feet. And aside from the blood loss, he was pale as a ghost and speechless, with eyes wide with shock. For someone of his stature, it was beyond abnormal to see him in such a state of abject horror. In fact, many of us genuinely assumed it was impossible. Without question, all of us sprinted towards the trucks, quickly loading them up and starting them as we left the site. Being a passenger in the vehicle with Davy, I turned to him and immediately noticed his expression being one of pure, unadulterated fear. What happened in there? Where's Al? And Davy shook his head and clutched the steering wheel even harder as he turned to me. Al is dead, Finn. And those weren't rats. Whatever they were, they tore him to shreds. And what's left of him we could barely even identify, he added with a shaky voice. The sound of the tires on stone enveloped the air, as both I and the other 2 crew that had hopped in the passenger cab were unable to formulate a proper response. And eventually, we reached an intersection with 3 narrow tunnels, and Davy quickly turned into the one leading to the surface. And soon thereafter, however, Davy's radio crackled to life, with Margot's voice emerging from the device. "We're missing a truck. They were falling behind us and didn't make the turn," she commented with the urgency in her voice indicating that Angus had conveyed the situation to them as well. We looked in the rearview mirror and noticed that they were in fact 1 truck short. Despite 4 having left the site, there were now only 3 in a single file line of vehicles. Davy slammed the steering wheel and released a string of obscenities before turning the vehicle around. He rolled down the window and ordered that the remaining trucks stay put as we traversed the short distance back to the entrance of the tunnel. And upon arriving, we turned back towards the opening, only to see a rather unwelcome sight. And half the length of the shaft was now submerged in complete darkness. Portable work lights along the nearest half of the cavern wall were the only source of light, and the lights nearest to us began to flicker, and eventually failing themselves upon our arrival. And just like within the facility, the remaining lights reflected now various sets of eyes at the edge of the darkness. Some at ground level, others seemingly 20 feet or more in the air. And there seemed to be dozens of them. And as another set of work lights extinguished themselves, I could almost have sworn that more sets of eyes appeared. And aside from the occasional popping of one of the lights, it was eerily silent, dead silent. Most notably, the remaining truck wasn't anywhere in the sight, having evidently broken down far beyond what was now the reach of the light. Nobody within that vehicle had been present in the facility, meaning the full urgency of the situation was likely not understood by them. Davy, likely realizing this, loudly called out to them, his voice cracking while doing so. Upon receiving no response, he yelled out once more, his voice echoing across the cavern walls. Again, no response. And for a moment we sat in silence, awaiting any sign that the occupants of the truck were still there, only for more silence to follow. And eventually, more work lights popped, with the line of darkness now becoming precariously close. Davy once more released a stream of obscenities, before grabbing his lamp and rushing to the edge of the light, shining it across the cavern from left to right. The various set of eyes seemed to avoid the light, shifting to remain outside of the direct beam, filling the air with an unnerving skittling sound. And eventually the beam reflected off the white paint of a truck at the furthest wall of the cavern, with the doors eerily left open. The light reflected off a mound lying directly outside the door, which to our horror, we quickly identified as one of the reflective stripes on our high-visibility jackets. The jacket was evidently still attached to something solid, but the spacing between the visibility stripes indicated that it was no longer a single piece. Nearly on cue, Davy's lamp began flickering once more. He quickly took notice and sprinted back to the well-lit area as it extinguished itself. Without a word, we loaded back into the truck and began making our way back through the narrow tunnel. However, just as we were approaching the remaining 2 trucks, ours began slowing down and eventually came to a complete stop. Davy attempted to restart it to no avail, with a gauge on the dash indicating that the battery, which had had enough juice to last all shift, had already been depleted. Without any hesitation, we exited the truck and began sprinting to reconvene with the rest of the crew, each of them now outside of their vehicles as well. Mark, being in the last truck of the group, immediately noticed us returning without the 3 missing members of the crew, and leaned against the side of the truck, with his head in his hands. Angus was standing nearby, and now had a blood-soaked t-shirt wrapped around his arm. Margot had the hood of one of the vehicles open, and eventually slammed it shut in clear defeat. She made her way over to us, as did the rest of the crew, and shared further unfortunate news. The battery on both trucks is completely drained. I tried to radio back through the surface, but the units aren't working either, and she stated, and the weight of the situation was becoming evident to those who were still somewhat unaware. Silence filled the air for a brief moment, before the faint sound of another bulb popping drew our attention. We turned to face the entrance of the tunnel, and noticed that the cavern outside the entrance was now completely black. The lights nearest to the entrance had begun to flicker, as were the ones directly above us. Davy quickly sprung into action and retrieved a folded piece of paper from the glove box of the nearest vehicle. And after unfolding the large sheet of paper on the hood, he scanned it with his finger, and before signaling the rest of us over. The paper before us was a map of the caverns, with Davy pointing at a spot midway through the tunnel ahead of us. That's the closest rescue chamber. We can't hoof it all the way to the surface, but the chamber is sturdy and has supplies. We should at least be able to wait it out in there and call for some help. And everyone unanimously agreed, and we quickly retrieved the functioning lamps from the back of the nearest truck, before beginning to jog as a group through the tunnel. Angus was in the back of the group, and I fell behind to run alongside him. His condition was noticeably quite rough, though the adrenaline alone would almost certainly keep him going until we were safe. Well, relatively safe. Though I hesitated initially, I eventually asked him what happened within that facility. What went down in there? He was silent for a moment, then eventually answered, "They got out, lad. Tore him from limb to limb." He weakly replied in between breaths, pausing for a moment. "The room was full of them, and I barely had a chance to back out the doorway before my light died." He grabbed his arm and winced in pain. Once the room went dark, and something lunged at me and ripped a fat chunk out my arm. And if Davey hadn't rushed over with his lamp, they would have got me as well. And we both fell silent, returning our focus to the pathway ahead. And for a while, nothing but the sound of echoing footsteps filled the air, along with the faint popping of lights in the distance. Another 5 minutes of running, and I checked behind us and noticed that darkness had expanded well beyond the entrance to the tunnel. And in fact, it nearly seemed to be keeping pace with us, as only around 200 feet of the tunnel was sufficiently lit behind us. And Davey also looked back behind us and took notice of this, and picking up his pace as he encouraged the rest of us to do the same. "Almost there. Let's pick up the pace and go." Exhaustion and an audible sense of fear were becoming evident in his voice as it shook with each word. Knowing him quite well, along with his generally blunt and unexpressive mannerisms, it was an unnerving thing to notice. The rest of the crew seemed to pick up on this as well, as the collective pace increased to a sprint. Eventually, a sign became visible on the ceiling ahead, with an arrow pointing towards an opening in the right of the tunnel. And upon reaching it, we were greeted by a welcoming sight. The reinforced steel chassis of the rescue chamber, with a small light above the door, signifying that it was in complete working order. Without a second of hesitation, Davy and Margot reached the heavy door and collectively opened it. One by one, the remaining crew filed inside and taking a seat alongside the long benches on either sides of the capsule. And I followed, as did Davy and Margot once everyone was inside. And after closing and securing the heavy door, Davy collapsed onto the bench, placing his face in his hands and going silent. And for 10 minutes, nobody spoke a word. The chamber was cramped and any noise would noticeably echo within, but nothing aside from our bated breaths could be heard. The unwelcome sound of bulbs shattering became faintly audible through the door, initially seeming a slight distance away, only soon to be fairly close. And as the sound began to reach the tunnel directly outside the door, Margot silently stood up, verifying the door was properly secured before once more sitting down. The sound of bulbs shattering passed by outside the door, then slowly faded as it continued through the remaining stretch of the tunnel. The overhead light within the chamber began to flicker, then dimmed, but it remained on. And shortly after, another sound became faintly audible. The sound of something hard, such as nails, lightly scraping and tapping on the outside of the chamber. And it started out relatively unnoticeable, but quickly escalated in both frequency and volume until it was all that could be heard. It came from the walls, the door, and the ceiling. It echoed throughout the inside of the chamber at a deafening frequency. Angus covered his ears and began sobbing, while the remaining crew was visibly barely keeping it together. To our delight, however, the light remained functional, despite having dimmed by a large margin. In fact, most of the remaining electronics within the chamber appeared at least slightly functional, something that was likely due to the immensely thick steel construction of the chamber's exterior. And after around half an hour, the sound faded, and silence once more filled the room. And after a moment, Davy quietly stood up and began tinkering with the radio. Thankfully, it still functioned, and allowed connectivity with the surface. And upon explaining the situation to management, they informed us that a rescue team would be en route shortly, but was currently delayed due to site-wide equipment problems. The explanations of the things down here fell on deaf ears, as the individuals on the surface simply attributed our accounts to oxygen deprivation, induced hallucinations, and suggested that we activate the chamber air supply. No amount of convincing from the rest of the crew could change their mind, and we eventually had to simply concede and hope for the best, both for our safety and for the safety of those individuals being sent to rescue us. And that brings us to the present. As I write this, the multiple tablets were discovered in a supply locker connected to the company internet. With a thankfully significant amount of power still contained in each crew member took turns contacting loved ones, along with informing the families of those who perished of their fate. Once I had done the same, I took it upon myself to construct this account in order to spread awareness of the events that transpired today. We've been in the rescue chamber for well over 5 hours at this point, and there hasn't been any additional word from the rescue team or the surface. We're trying to conserve as much battery as possible, so I'll go ahead and end this here. I'll attempt to upload this in various areas online to get maximum coverage, but the internet is painfully slow, so it could take a while for anything to post. If there's any major updates or we somehow make it out, I'll provide additional information. And if you happen to come across this, thank you for reading. Wish us luck. We're clearly going to need it.